The Lullaby of Hollow Hill. The village of Hollow Hill was not marked on any map. It was the kind of place that existed in whispers, a name murmured by travelers who claimed to have stumbled upon it by accident, but could never quite remember how to find it again. For Dr. Evelyn Hart, a folklorist with a penchant for the obscure, it was the perfect subject for her next research project. She had spent months piecing together fragments of stories, tales of a remote village where children sang a lullaby so haunting it could make the bravest soul shiver. The song, they said, had been passed down for generations, its origins lost to time. But there was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of those stories. Something Evelyn was determined to uncover. The journey to Hollow Hill was arduous. The roads narrowed to dirt paths, the forests grew denser, and the air became thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. By the time Evelyn arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cluster of weathered cottages that made up the village. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. As she stepped out of her car, a group of children appeared, their faces pale and solemn. They stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, before turning and disappearing into the shadows. Evelyn made her way to the village inn, a ramshackle building with a crooked sign that read, "The Restful Traveler." The innkeeper, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a permanent frown, greeted her with a nod. "You're the folklorist," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded, introducing herself and explaining her interest in the village's traditions. The innkeeper's expression darkened. "Best leave it alone," he muttered, handing her a key. "Some things ain't meant to be studied." That night, Evelyn lay awake in her room, the inn's creaky floorboards and the distant hoot of an owl keeping her from sleep. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a faint, melodic hum drifting through the walls. It was the lullaby. She sat up, her heart racing. The tune was unlike anything she had ever heard, both beautiful and unsettling, with a rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The village square was empty, but the song grew louder, as if carried on the wind. The next morning, Evelyn set out to explore the village. The residents were wary of her, their eyes darting away when she tried to make conversation. The children, however, were different. They followed her at a distance, their faces expressionless, their lips moving silently, as if rehearsing the lullaby. When she approached them, they scattered like leaves in the wind, disappearing into the narrow alleys between the cottages. It wasn't until she met old Maud, the village's self-proclaimed historian, that Evelyn began to piece together the truth. Maud was a frail woman with a voice like gravel, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but sharp with intelligence. She invited Evelyn into her home, a cramped cottage filled with dusty books and jars of preserved herbs. "You've heard the song," Maud said, her tone accusatory. Evelyn nodded, and the old woman sighed. "It's not just a lullaby, you know. It's a warning, a prayer, a shield." Maud explained that the lullaby had been sung in Hollow Hill for as long as anyone could remember. It was taught to every child, passed down from mother to daughter, father to son. The song, she said, was meant to keep something at bay, something that slept beneath the hills, something ancient and hungry. "We call it the sleeper," Maud whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been here since before the village, since before the forests. And if it wakes, if it sings back—" She trailed off, her eyes distant. Evelyn's curiosity was piqued. She spent the next few days documenting the lullaby, recording the children's voices as they sang it in unison. The song was hauntingly beautiful, but there was an undercurrent of fear in their voices, a tension that made Evelyn's skin crawl. She began to notice other things, too. The way the villagers avoided the hills, the way the ground seemed to tremble faintly at night, the way the lullaby never stopped, not even for a moment. One evening, as Evelyn sat in the village square transcribing the lyrics, a young girl approached her. She couldn't have been more than 6, her hair a tangled mess, her dress frayed at the edges. "You shouldn't be here," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sleeper doesn't like strangers." Evelyn smiled, trying to put the child at ease. "I'm just here to learn," she said. The girl shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "It's listening," she said, "always listening. And if it hears you, if it sings back—" She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she began to hum the lullaby, her voice trembling. That night, Evelyn's sleep was plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of the hills, their slopes shifting and writhing like the coils of a great beast. She dreamed of the sleeper, a shapeless mass of darkness with a voice that echoed in her bones. And she dreamed of the lullaby, its melody twisting into something discordant and wrong. She woke in a cold sweat, the sound of humming still ringing in her ears. The next day, Evelyn decided to visit the hills. The villagers tried to stop her, their faces pale with fear, but she was determined. She followed a narrow path that wound its way up the slope, the trees growing sparser as she climbed. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the ground beneath her feet felt unnaturally warm. At the top of the hill, she found a clearing, a circle of bare earth surrounded by gnarled trees. In the center was a deep, dark hole, its edges smooth as if carved by human hands. Evelyn approached the hole cautiously, her heart pounding. As she peered into the darkness, she heard it, a faint, melodic hum, echoing from deep within the earth. It was the lullaby, but different, distorted, as if sung by a voice that didn't understand the words. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, and she stumbled back, her mind reeling. The sleeper was real, and it was waking. She raced back to the village, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The villagers were gathered in the square, their faces grim. They knew what she had done. "You've disturbed it," Maud said, her voice shaking with anger. "Now we'll all pay the price." Evelyn tried to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the hum of the lullaby growing louder, more insistent. The villagers began to sing, their voices rising in unison, the lullaby weaving through the air like a shield. But it wasn't enough. The sleeper's song grew louder, drowning out their voices, the ground shaking violently. Evelyn watched in horror as the hills began to shift, the earth cracking open to reveal a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. And then it emerged, a shapeless mass of shadow, its voice a cacophony of discordant notes that made Evelyn's ears bleed. The villagers' song faltered, their voices breaking as the sleeper's power overwhelmed them. Evelyn fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her ears, but the sound was inside her, tearing at her mind. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the sleeper, its form shifting and writhing, its song echoing through the hills. And then there was silence. When Evelyn woke, the village was gone. The cottages were reduced to rubble, the ground scarred and barren. The hills were silent, the sleeper's song replaced by an eerie stillness. Evelyn stumbled to her feet, her mind reeling. She was alone. But as she made her way down the path, she heard it, a faint, melodic hum carried on the wind. It was the lullaby, but different, distorted, and it was coming from inside her. Evelyn spent the next few days immersed in the village's history, determined to understand the origins of the lullaby and the sleeper. Old Maud became her reluctant guide, her voice trembling as she recounted the tales passed down through generations. Long before this village existed, Maud began. "The hills were a place of worship. The ancient ones who lived here believed the earth was alive, a living, breathing entity. They called it the Sleeper, though they never dared to speak its name aloud. They built shrines and offered sacrifices, hoping to keep it content. But one day, a foolish priest decided to wake it, to harness its power. He sang a song, a forbidden melody, and the Sleeper stirred." Maud paused, her hands shaking as she poured a cup of bitter tea. The earth split open, and the Sleeper emerged, its voice a cacophony that drove the priest mad. The villagers tried to appease it, but it was too late. The Sleeper consumed them one by one, until only a handful remained. Those who survived crafted the lullaby, a song of protection, to keep the Sleeper at bay. They built this village as a warning, a reminder of what happens when the Sleeper wakes. Evelyn listened intently, her mind racing. The story was fantastical, but the fear in Maud's eyes was real. "Why hasn't anyone left?" she asked. "If the Sleeper is so dangerous, why stay here?" Maud's expression darkened. "The Sleeper doesn't let go of what it claims. Those who try to leave, they don't make it far. The hills have a way of bringing them back." Evelyn's fascination with the lullaby grew. She spent hours with the village children, recording their voices as they sang the haunting melody. The song was complex, its lyrics a mix of archaic words and nonsense syllables. The children sang it with a solemnity that belied their age, their eyes distant, as if they were in a trance. One afternoon, Evelyn noticed something strange. The children's voices seemed to harmonize in a way that defied explanation, the notes weaving together to create a sound that was almost otherworldly. When she played back the recording, she heard something else, a faint, discordant hum beneath the children's voices, a sound that hadn't been there during the recording. She mentioned it to Maud, who grew pale. "That's the Sleeper," she whispered. "It's always listening, always waiting." The first tremor struck that night. Evelyn was transcribing the lullaby's lyrics when the ground beneath her feet shuddered, the walls of the inn creaking ominously. The villagers rushed into the square, their faces pale with fear. The children began to sing, their voices rising in unison, the lullaby weaving through the air like a shield. Evelyn watched in awe as the tremors subsided, the ground growing still once more. But the fear in the villagers' eyes remained. "It's getting stronger," one of them muttered. "The lullaby isn't enough anymore." Evelyn's dreams grew worse. She saw the Sleeper in her sleep, its form shifting and writhing, its voice a cacophony that made her blood run cold. She woke each night drenched in sweat, the sound of humming still ringing in her ears. One night she decided to confront the Sleeper. Armed with her recorder and a flashlight, she made her way to the hills, the lullaby echoing in her mind. The clearing was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. As she approached the hole, she heard it, a faint, melodic hum, echoing from deep within the earth. She pressed record, her hands trembling. The Sleeper's song was unlike anything she had ever heard, a discordant melody that seemed to twist and writhe, defying comprehension. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the hum growing louder, more insistent. And then it emerged, a shapeless mass of shadow, its voice a cacophony that made Evelyn's ears bleed. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her ears, but the sound was inside her, tearing at her mind. The villagers found her the next morning, unconscious at the edge of the clearing. She was rushed back to the village, her body racked with fever. When she woke, the village was in chaos. The tremors had grown stronger, the Sleeper's song echoing through the hills. The villagers gathered in the square, their voices rising in unison as they sang the lullaby. But it wasn't enough. The sleeper's power was too great, its song drowning out their voices. Evelyn watched in horror as the earth split open, the sleeper emerging in all its terrible glory. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the sleeper, its form shifting and writhing, its song echoing through the hills. And then there was silence. The stranger in the window. It began with a fleeting glance, the kind of thing that one might notice and forget in an instant. But for Anna, that moment stretched out in time, growing into something far more insidious. She had always been a creature of habit. Every evening after a long day at work, she would make herself a cup of tea, settle by the window, and watch the world outside as she let her mind unwind. Her townhouse was modest but comfortable, nestled on a quiet suburban street where the houses all looked the same, well-kept, ordinary, safe. She liked it that way. The predictable rhythm of life gave her comfort. Then, one evening, as she sat at her desk with her laptop open, she happened to glance outside. Her eyes swept across the street, her gaze catching on the house directly opposite hers. It had been vacant for months after the previous owners had moved away unexpectedly. The windows were dark, the porch empty, the curtains still drawn. But in one of the second-floor windows a shadow stood. Anna frowned, blinking as if her eyes were deceiving her. The figure was motionless, a silhouette against the dim glow of a street lamp. Something about the shape unsettled her. Too tall, too thin. The longer she stared, the more convinced she became that whoever it was looking directly at her. Her rational mind tried to make sense of it. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, the reflection of something from inside the house. But as she watched, the figure remained perfectly still. She told herself it wasn't anything to be afraid of. Maybe a homeless person had broken in, or maybe the house had finally sold, and she simply hadn't noticed the new owners moving in. She closed her laptop, turned off the light, and went to bed, determined to forget about it. The next night, the figure was still there. And the night after that. Anna tried to ignore the feeling creeping up her spine. At first, she avoided looking out of the window altogether. But curiosity gnawed at her, a constant, nagging presence. On the fourth night, she couldn't help herself. She parted the curtains ever so slightly and peeked outside. The figure was still standing there, still watching. She felt her pulse quicken, a strange mix of fear and fascination settling over her. It had been days. If someone had moved into the house, why had she never seen lights turning on or off? Why had there been no movement, no shifting of curtains, no sign of life? That night she struggled to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the figure standing even closer, watching, waiting. Then came the dreams. She dreamt that she was standing at her window, staring out at the figure. Only this time, it wasn't across the street. It was in her own window, inside her own home. It reached out toward her, its long, spindly fingers brushing against the glass. When she tried to scream, no sound came out. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering in her chest. Sweat clung to her skin, the darkness around her suddenly feeling suffocating. She had to do something. The next morning, she waited until she saw Mr. Langley, her elderly neighbor, outside tending to his garden. He was one of the few people on the street she actually spoke to. He had lived there for decades, had seen families come and go. If anyone knew what was going on with that house, it would be him. "Mr. Langley," she called as she approached him, trying to keep her voice light. "Have you noticed anything strange about the house across from mine?" The old man wiped his hands on his gardening gloves and frowned at her. "Strange? How do you mean?" Anna hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. I think someone is inside In the upstairs window. I see them every night, but they never move." Mr. Langley's expression darkened. He glanced over at the house, then back at her. "That house has been empty for nearly a year," he said, his voice quiet. "The Thompsons left in a hurry and no one's been there since." A cold sensation settled in Anna's chest. "But I've seen someone," she insisted. "Every night." For a long moment, Mr. Langley said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You should keep your curtains closed." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. That night, Anna locked her doors, closed her curtains, and tried to push the conversation out of her mind. Maybe she was just seeing things. Maybe stress and lack of sleep were making her paranoid. She settled into bed, determined not to think about it. Then at 2:47 a.m., she heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She lay frozen, listening, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing. After several minutes, she forced herself to move, to creep toward the front door. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the peephole. She held her breath and looked through. No one was there. The street was empty. The porch light flickered slightly, but there was no sign of movement. She double-checked the locks and turned away, her stomach twisting with unease. She needed sleep. Maybe she had imagined it. Then, as she passed the living room, her eyes flickered toward the darkened window, and she froze. The figure was no longer in the house across the street. It was standing in her own window. Anna stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. She turned wildly, scanning the room, but it was empty. The only thing staring back at her was her own reflection. Or so she thought, because as she stood there trying to steady her breathing, she realized something was off. Her reflection was smiling, but she wasn't. A strangled gasp escaped her lips as the grin in the glass widened, stretching beyond the limits of human expression. The eyes darkened, hollowing out into voids of inky blackness, and then, in a single horrifying moment, the reflection lifted a hand, not to wave, to knock. The sound echoed from inside the glass, a deep, resonant tap that sent her scrambling backward. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the nightmare to end. But when she opened them, the reflection was gone. Anna didn't sleep. She packed a bag and fled to a motel on the outskirts of town, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever had taken root in her home. She refused to look in mirrors, avoided windows, kept every surface covered. But she couldn't escape it. That night, as she sat on the motel bed, her back against the headboard, she glanced at the darkened screen of the television, and there, in the reflection, was the figure. Not standing in a window, not standing outside, standing right behind her. A whisper brushed against her ear, a breath that wasn't her own. She turned slowly, her body rigid with terror, and for the first time she saw its face. Not a stranger's, her own, twisted, smiling. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was her own voice whispering back, "I told you not to look."